studio, and he'll be talking about the journey of that studio, which is about to release its first game. We have a great panel looking at the crossover worlds of IP and games, featuring Lisa Burgess, the GM at Netflix. We've got John Haidt, the president of Wizards of the Coast, and Pete Wanat, I think that's pronounced right, president of interactive technology at Agbo. That's the company that's owned by the Russo brothers. We also welcome Matt Piscatella, the executive director of Circana, who'll be looking at the macro conditions specifically in the US market. We're just about to announce today, that Blizzard's Haiwen Yao, who's the executive producer of Diablo Immortal, and Shannon Williams, the senior director of mobile at Blizzard, has also joined the bill. They're using their experience with Diablo Immortal to discuss the roles that mobile can play in helping traditional AAA PC and console brands reach global audiences. And they'll talk about how they navigated Western mobile stigma versus Eastern enthusiasm, what comes next for the game, and sort of mobile in general. So that's our other session that we're announcing. We may have another announcement in the newsletter, but at the time of recording, that hasn't been confirmed yet. So it's looking really good. There's two ways you can attend the event. You can apply for and purchase a Summer Game Fest industry ticket, which gets you all sorts of stuff, as well as the event. You get play days, you get some food and drink, valet parking, there's a gift bag, there's a reception, all sorts. So that's $500. But if you just want to come and see our conference, you want to come along with the recording of the show, you can apply for free tickets. You only have to week to register for free tickets. May 20th is when we're stopping registrations. If you visit www.thegamebusiness.com, in the top bar of that website, you will see the Switch 2 release, and most of those games are not getting reviewed, and I just think that's going to harm that. But we obsess with launch, don't we? And there's actually, Donkey Kong's out in July, there's a Metroid game, there's a Pokemon game. By the time we get to Christmas, which is always the massive crucial period.
Yeah, that is an important period. So, I mean, obviously launch is important, but in terms of the importance of how the year is structured, then the end of the year and getting some momentum going into the end of the year is obviously the most important thing. And obviously it's freed up to an extent because of the delays to GTA 6. The GTA 6 proposition is not just a software proposition, it's an upgrade to PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series proposition. And obviously people that are not spending on those may be kind of more tempted.
Alone without a big single player Nintendo game, I know, Matt, you can play that
to an extent.
Do you think, is there potentially an element of Nintendo losing a little bit of confidence here? Because they haven't got the value message across, I don't think, for the Switch 2. The consensus is that it's expensive. There's these headlines that's accelerated quite a bit since then. You know, their brands are bigger. They've got 128, I think they said they've got 128 million active players over the last year. That's a very different scenario than when they were Wii U, when the Wii U going into the Switch and the 3DS going into the Switch. They didn't have anywhere near it, that level of players. Mario's huge and Pokemon's huge, but they weren't as strong as they are now. So I would
how it's going to swing back, whether it's going to actually be implemented, what impact it's going to be. They made a valid point about the price point, but everything is more expensive now. And I think the
corresponding challenges to early adoption. He adds, we are taking steps like bundling software with the hardware to accelerate adoption in the first financial results. Nintendo estimates that they will sell in 50 report that Piers has been working on. It's sort of financial season in the video games industry. We'll delve a bit more into that actually, I think next week when more of the financials come out. But so far, they're broadly pretty good. EA's was very positive, better than I was expecting. Capcom was obviously fantastic. There's been a few surprises in there. One of the big surprises for me came with the Nintendo financial results. Nintendo estimates that they will sell in 15 million Switch 2 consoles by the end of its financial year, which most analysts seem to believe it's quite conservative. When questioned about the estimation, Nintendo CEO Shintaro Furukawa, I always get that wrong, but you know what I mean, said Nintendo Switch 2 is priced relatively high compared to Nintendo Switch, so we recognise that there are corresponding challenges to early adoption. He adds, we are taking steps like bundling software with the hardware to accelerate adoption in the first fiscal year, aiming to get off to the same start we did with Nintendo Switch. Additionally, the tariff situation in the US or a possibility of a recession did not affect our sales volume forecast either. In order to achieve sales of 15 million units, we will need to manufacture the hardware in quantities greater than that. Our first goal is to get off to the same start we did with Nintendo Switch, and we're working to strengthen our production capacity so we can respond flexibly to demand. Piers, is Nintendo being cautious here?
I think a little bit. I mean, obviously, there are quite a few unknowns, aren't there? I mean, the whole tariff situation is an unknown, you know, how it's going to swing back, whether it's going to actually be implemented, what impact it's going to be. They made a valid point about the price point, but everything is more expensive now. And I think the OLED came into the market at $350. $50. I think. See, it's got to be more expensive than that. So it seems at 450, it seemed like the right price point in effect for the new product. I don't think that's going to really put off people, certainly in the first year of adopting the platform. I think people that are into Nintendo, they love the products, they love the brand and everything, and they'll be willing to spend that amount. I don't see it as a major impact. Our kind of forecast for actually people buying the console for this year is a little over 13 million, which is slightly ahead. It's not dissimilar, but it's slightly ahead of the original Switch.
Well, I just think Nintendo's accelerated quite a bit since then. You know, their brands are bigger. They've got 128. I think they said they've got 128 million active players over the last year. That's a very different scenario than when they were Wii U, when the Wii U going into the Switch and the 3DS going into the Switch. They didn't have anywhere near that level of players. Mario's huge and Pokemon's huge, but they weren't as strong as they are now. So I would have expected a faster adoption.
That's the I think that's the argument is you've got all these more active users, so you should be selling to a kind of bigger audience, and hopefully that would be reflected in the uptake. You know, our forecast, we're playing it relatively cautious, but then it looks like Nintendo's doing the same thing with their 15 million for the first year. There's a few unknowns. I don't think they really understand how it's going to transition from a Switch to a Switch 2 in terms of the product evolution and stuff. And then you've got this whole kind of backwards compatibility situation, which means that, you know, conceivably people might want to hang on to the Switch. It's still relevant in the market to an extent.
Do you think, is there potentially an element of Nintendo losing a little bit of confidence here? Because they haven't got the value message across, I don't think, for the Switch 2. The consensus is that it's expensive. There's these headlines that say getting Zelda on Switch 2 will cost you £90 or $90, I think it was. When the reality is, if you've already got the game and you've got a Nintendo Switch Online membership, it'll cost you nothing. Those are the value arguments. You know, you can share your games now using Switch 2. There are things about it that make it a better value deal in some ways. They seem to be lost, drowned under the headline prices. There's that bit to it. You know, when Mario Kart Direct was flooded with comments of lower the price, lower the price, lower the price. You've got that sort of online noise. I do think it's died down a little bit, and I don't know if I'm surprised that Xbox has sort of done something there.
Yeah.
The other thing is you've got an awful lot of fuss over these game key cards and the fact that a lot of the games aren't on the cartridge. You've got people questioning the lack of innovation in the hardware, which I don't think is overly fair. I don't think you do. PlayStation and Xbox don't seem to get that quite so much, but there's a bit of that going on. I think Nintendo fans are on board. I think people who love the Switch will want the Switch too. So that's my belief on it. But I do wonder if Mario Kart alone, without a big single-player Nintendo game, that's not, I know, Matt, you can play Mario Kart single-player, but it's not Mario, it's not Zelda.
I do agree to an extent, but if you've been following what's been in demand or what's being demanded by the player base, they've always, you know, they've talked about an upgraded Switch for several years now. I mean, that has been massively in demand. So they've done what really the fan base wants, deliver an improved Switch. I agree that there's some sort of magic missing there in the context of we like to see an entirely new kind of Nintendo experiences, which combines the kind of hardware with the software, and you get something magical in that respect. So there's a little bit of magic missing because of this more kind of evolutionary development of the hardware, I think.
There's another bit that worried me a little bit in that I felt this way for the first Switch. I was a bit worried about it. And then like in the week and 2 weeks before the event, maybe it was in the week before it launched, there was so much hype around the Zelda game. And then it sort of just became this big thing. It's had a few times I've seen Nintendo games sort of come out of the gate quite late, and it may be the case with Switch 2. But I've found out in the last 24 hours that there are 4 journalists, 2 of them very, very senior journalists in the games industry, told me that Nintendo aren't doing review copies of the Switch 2 units. Now, I'm sure some of the biggest sites must be getting one. I find it mad that they wouldn't be. Now, I understand the reasoning Nintendo's given is because of there's going to be a big major day one patch. And I guess that it could just be that Switch 2 is coming in hotter than you might expect. You know, it's not actually, you know, from a software side, it's not ready yet, and it's not going to be ready for review in advance. But I've had publishers come to me and say, have you heard about Switch 2 units at all? One publisher said to me that the situation is such that they do wonder if they'd have been better off not being part of the launch lineup so they could get, because they're really, really confident in their game. They could have got some reviews out there. I don't know if they really think that. I'm sure it's true, you know, you take it at face value. If it's about patches, it's about patches. But the idea of there being a Switch 2 release and most of those games are not getting reviewed, and I just think that's going to harm that But we obsess with launch, don't we? And it's actually Donkey Kong's out in July. There's a Metroid game. There's a Pokemon game. By the time we get to Christmas, which is always the massive, massive crucial period.
Yeah, that is an important period. So, I mean, obviously launch is important, but in terms of the importance of how the year is structured, then the end of the year and getting some momentum going into the end of the year is obviously the most important thing. And obviously it's freed up to an extent because of the delays to GTA 6. The GTA 6 proposition is not just a software proposition, it's an upgrade to PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series proposition. And obviously people that are not spending on those may be kind of more tempted by a Switch 2.
Lovely segue moment there. Let's talk about Puppet, which is Amber is just about to release. It's updated predictions for 2025 and looking at key growth areas for the industry in general. It's in a new report that is probably not out yet.
It's about to come. Yeah, it's on the cusp of arriving. Yeah,
because I guess it makes sense to do that now. We now know what the Nintendo Switch 2 is. You know roughly what the games are coming out for. You know, it had the delay to Grand Theft Auto. I put Grand Theft Auto 5 in my notes. GTA 6. You're predicting quite small growth now for the games industry in 2025.
Yeah, this is spending on games, content, and services. So it doesn't include hardware, but across all device categories, all channels, all monetization models. Just spending, not advertising revenue. We're predicting around a 1% growth this year. So pretty shallow in that respect. And that is reflecting a hit of shifting GTA 6 into 2026. And obviously that boosts 2026, but it has a knock-on impact on 2025. You know, the hope was that the console sector was going to be one of the key drivers of some growth this year, but that's obviously been reduced quite significantly by the delay.
You've got some numbers here where you think, was it a $2.7 billion hit on console business, 700,000 fewer console sales? Have I got that right? Have I read that right?
Yeah, so our sort of before and after with GTA 6 coming and then obviously delaying into 2026, we've reduced our series and PlayStation 5 sales volume of about 700,000. And we've also reduced sales across those platforms in terms of sales volume of games by about 20 million. And that amounts to about 2.7 billion of impact. So it's quite significant.
Yeah.
You'd expect people to spend on other things if they haven't got the money to spend on GTA 6 or buy a new console if they want to play it desperately. But that kind of transfer will not be entire. We're sure there's going to be a significant downward impact.
I agree with you in that I think the Switch 2 is going to benefit a little bit from this, partly because it's almost got... There are some PS5 games coming, including from Sony, and obviously Xbox, you know, they will sell units around Christmas like they always do, but they don't have that big thing to push the hardware. And maybe if you're thinking of getting a console for Christmas, there's Switch 2s. I've always had this argument that Switch has an older audience, and I think people realise, but also the people that grew up with GTA are parents today buying consoles for their children. So you've got that element to it as well. But do you expect Switch 2 will actually be taking some of the audience that would have gone to PS5?
Yeah, I think it's kind of naive to say because GTA is a certain audience, a certain game, that people will not be spending on kind of alternative products. I mean, they may spend it on other forms of entertainment. They may do other things. They may go to the cinema or whatever. But, you know, they're all in the same sphere of entertainment spending and also spending time on content. And there's a broader kind of competitive analysis that can be done here. And I'm sure there is a lot of crossover. Certainly in our consumer data shows that the ownership, Switch is often seen as a kind of second device for owners of PlayStation 5, for example. In key markets, the overlap of ownership is quite significant. So there are in the same competitive sphere, even though the content is not necessarily the same. They're sort of battling it out for the same cash.
It's a bit interesting this year because there is a Madden, which hasn't been on Switch in the past. EA have started putting the FIFA or EA Sports FC, the actual proper versions of those games on Switch now. It's not the legacy edition. You've got games like Cyberpunk. There's a From Software game. I don't know if this year's Call of Duty will be on Switch too, but obviously Xbox signed that agreement with Nintendo.
Definitely getting closer. Definitely getting closer to each other in terms of third-party support.
Yeah.
And the third-party support is really important because obviously, as you already said, the first-party lineup is okay, but it doesn't have Zelda, doesn't have the Mario platform. You know, the third-party stuff is going to do quite a lot of the kind of encouragement to buy into the platform.
How do you expect publishers to react to that GTA delay? And I ask that because I was actually surprised. 2K Games has announced that Mafia is coming out. Their new Mafia game, The Old Country, is coming out in August, which was rumoured before. But I was actually surprised they didn't use this opportunity to...
A bit later in the year, you mean?
Yeah, just push it a bit later. You've got that space now. quite a congested window, that August September window. I don't expect we're going to see many games be pushed forward. I don't think development's that kind of easy to maneuver at the minute. And we've already seen that Amy Hennig's Marvel game has just been delayed into 2026. Actually, I think we might see some delays. But I'm interested how you see GTA impact.
Opens up a window, doesn't it? But
yeah,
at this stage, how easy is it to really kind of significantly adjust launch windows, especially when you're banking on hitting at a certain time? You're expecting revenue to be coming in. Is it realistic to be delaying those? I think we've discussed this before. It's not just about launch timing and stuff, which is obviously important, but it's about being able to be heard in what is an environment which will be kind of dominated by GTA 6 whenever that hits the market. Yeah, it's about discovery, finding audiences, getting people aware of your content and getting it discovered, as much as the kind of launch timing and stuff in respect of this year, I think. So it's a definite boon, definite benefit to other companies that are looking to launch in the second half of the year.
I look at the Fallout TV series at the end of the year, and Bethesda did a great job of capitalizing on the first series. I think you'll see diminishing returns on the second series, because I think a lot of people jumped in on that first series, but not necessarily in terms of viewership of the series. I mean, in terms of game sales. But, maybe there's an opportunity now for those sort of activities and things around legacy games. I talk about Mafia: The Old Country. Maybe it should have launched in October or November now that GTA has been delayed. But, there's no reason why they can't launch in August and then do a big push around it at the end of the year, around Black Friday.
That whole second season impact is a really interesting question at the moment internally, because we're trying to track what the impact is of the second series of Last of Us. Whether it's going to drive similar engagement compared to Series 1. Yeah, we're looking very closely at that. And I think, some of it's around, obviously, the interest and popularity of the series. If it's not quite delivering how people expect, then I think that will have a knock-on impact. Picking up on some of there's still, obviously, people really like it, but I'm not sure. The storyline is a little bit controversial in terms of how it's progressed. So,
yeah,
there's some people that are not enjoying it as much as they did the first season.
Yeah, well, they've changed that dynamic, haven't they? Because this was the twist. It's interesting because IGG did a report on something similar to this. And obviously, The Last of Us Part 2 TV show, there's their PC release of, I'm trying to remember now, of a version of the game was just before it, so they had a thing to tie into it. What I thought was really interesting was first two, the Halo TV series did quite decent stuff for Halo, but the second series didn't really, because I guess winning over the audiences or attracting audiences, they did it with the first series. But also, it's worth noting, Fallout, Sony done a few things around to tie in with the TV show or film versions of their stuff. Fallout really went for it, with the discount on the game and also on the subscription services, and it's fired at the top of the chart. Anyway,
that was a successful synergy.
Almost an aside. And where do you see the growth coming? You've got a bit of growth in the year for this year. Where's it coming from?
Well, regionally, it's coming from the kind of non-traditional regions. So Southeast Asia is looking pretty good. Middle East, Africa is looking pretty good. Obviously, they're smaller numbers as a whole, but the growth is better. This year, we're expecting pretty much flat performance in Europe and Western markets more generally.
Mm-hmm.
Asia as a whole, because it's such a wide expanse, has many different markets which are kind of up and down. China, I think, will continue to grow, but it's not really high growth. Japan and South Korea look more benign. They look, like they're not going to do anything too significant. And in terms of platform performance, so device categories and stuff like that, well, things were looking better for console, but obviously we've had the delay, so we're expecting that to be relatively flat. Mobile, I think what's interesting about mobile is we had pretty good growth last year in mobile, actually. We estimate around 4%. A lot of that is obviously driven by the App Store performance, so Apple App Store and Google Play. But there is like this building kind of off App Store monetization, also, instant gaming in browsers and other mobile channels which are starting to monetize. And that will become a more significant and less tracked part of the market. So we have to be kind of aware of, those other elements in the context of how it's performing as a whole, the mobile gaming market, because just looking at the App Store versus and Google Play, doesn't necessarily give you the full picture.
Right. I think Epic estimate as much as 50% of if you offer a discount via going directly via your Exodus store or whatever, they can estimate like up to half of the sales might come off the App Store now.
Yeah, I think that's probably a little bit ambitious.
I may have got the number slightly wrong. It might have been, but it was.
I mean, it depends how effectively they get players back onto mobile and playing the game, which if it comes to that, in terms of App Store and stuff. There's kind of trade-offs in strategies of getting your player base, or certainly the people who invest the most, off your platform. Some of the examples we see where it tends to be most active and is doing very well in the social casino space, for example, percentages they're not as high as 50%. I think that's probably a very big stretch goal, I would say.
Yeah.
But you have to give users kind of incentive to come off the platforms, and that's one of the challenge, and that's the impact of the margin. But
but it isn't because if you set up an Exodus store, your fee to Exodus is 5%, whereas if it's on App Store, your fee is 30%. You've got that 25% bit to play in, haven't you, in terms of offering a discount to users?
You're giving them an incentive which is, I don't know, 20% or something to come off the App Store or to monetize. I mean, what is interesting is that the kind of integrated solutions where you can select where to spend within the game, within the normal kind of native app environment. I mean, I think that's when it becomes really quite convincing, is that you can select a payment event, whether you do it through IP on the App Store or if you get directed off onto the web store or whatever, but it's much more integrated. If you can do that kind of in a very seamless way, then I think it's really quite significant. It's definitely interesting points that we've got to in respect to the market.
I was looking at the market this year so far, and video games, this is the UK, video game sales, this is unit sales, have dropped between 10 and 15% this year. I haven't got the exact figures.
Is that physical and as well as digital?
Physical and digital, yeah. It's just units though. In the US, in terms of revenue, which factors in all sorts of stuff like subscription, DLC, microtransactions, Circana reports that revenue was down 7% in terms of software and all that kind of stuff, spending on games, and hardware is down 32% for the first quarter of the year.
It's similar on a global level. The drop in hardware is similar.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal, and obviously it might get harder with these price rises. But obviously there's been successes. We've had, a schedule game, Monster Hunter Wilds, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion.
Schedule what now?
Yes, it.
Repo.
Split Fiction, Expedition 33, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I actually went on your system and I looked at last month in April, according to your data, purely looking at games that were released this year, so not looking at legacy games. There's no Fortnite or Call of Duty anywhere in this. I went back and there were 15 titles that had over 1 million players in April, which included some of the ones I basically mentioned above, but also there's things like Rematch and Atom 4 and that new RuneScape game, and South of Midnight, those sort of things. A lot of subscription games. I actually went back to the same time last year, but I wonder how that compares. Also, exactly 15 games in April that had over 1 million players.
Yeah, I haven't actually tracked the number of new games. I mean, I think there were some good games last year. This year, there's been a kind of, I think, a mix of games, which is quite interesting. Obviously, the different, types of companies that are making the games, from indie, from single developers.
Well, that's it. People have been going like, everyone should make games like Expedition 33 now because that was a big hit and that was a small team and blah blah blah. Yeah, but we also just had Assassin's
Relatively small team.
Yes. But we also had Assassin's Creed and we also had Monster Hunter Wilds and we've also had Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which had multiple hundreds of people working on those games and they were hits. And yeah, sure, you've got Split Fiction and Blueprints and is it Blueprints?
Blueprints, yeah. I mean, I think the question is, it's the kind of risk level. So if you're taking a long time and a lot of people are working on a title, the risk is obviously going up exponentially every time, depending on what game it is and whether it's a sequel or a follow-up or whatever, or part of a franchise. But if it's an original IP, obviously everything ratchets up in terms of the risk. So if Expedition 33 was a flop, the fallout would not have been as significant, say, as Monster Hunter Wilds if that was a flop, or the Creed was a flop, And there's such big bets now that, it's that kind of risk profile where you've got to assess, how much funding is going in.
We talked about last year about PlayStation and Concord, and there's a lot of analysis talking about how, they've made a mistake going into live service. Live service is too hard. But then that ignores the fact that less than 6 months earlier they launched Helldivers 2, which was a mega hit. and was a live service game from PlayStation that followed the exact same release structure. The game mate was different, obviously.
Unpredictable to an extent. I mean, there's a lot of sort of, unpredictability. It's hard to really understand if something. Obviously, you can listen to kind of feedback and the right to launch and understand kind of social activity and how people are feeling about the product and stuff. So it gives you an indication. But if a product takes 5 years to produce, then you only get to that point 6 months before the release. So, getting interest and building interest and understanding really what the feedback is a major risk and challenge.
In your report, you had a stat which is quite nice because it actually ties in with another story that I read just earlier today, where you said 32% of over 55s game in the US, which means there's a big opportunity to grow the market there in terms of attracting older gamers. And there was this report that came out from Germany, a study reveals that the average gamer in the country is now over 39 as the sort of gaming population and just generally gets older. As someone who is also getting older and plays games, I'm very mindful of the fact that so many of I think there's two sort of parts of this conversation, right? There's the older generations that don't game at all and never did. And I would argue they're quite challenging audience to reach because they probably didn't grow up with gaming. It probably wasn't part of their
absolutely
social circles. I think they're not gaming natives. And then there's probably people, I've got this in that now because I'm about to turn 40 and I've got a lot of friends who have families and things.
You're not old, Chris.
Certainly there weren't 40-year-old gamers when I was a kid. Not many. But these are people that might have grown up with games, but they've lapsed out of it. Games are long, it's a bit complicated, they don't have much time for those. And it seems to me that, particularly that last area, the industry's efforts to reach that audience has been like remasters and remakes and ports.
Yeah, a lot of nostalgia and stuff, yeah.
Well, here's the thing, I like to think that as gamers get older, that they're still open to new experiences. I don't know, is gaming like music where we all still listen to the same song we listened to when we were teenagers?
I think there's definitely a nostalgia kick and stuff, and remembering back to how you had a great gaming experience, you want to kind of recreate that. But yeah, I don't see why not. I think this is a great opportunity. You look in the US. We're forecasting the over 55 population to be 113 million, I think, by 2030. I think it's around 103 now. So it's a growing part, growing cohort within the total population. And a lot of these people have got, significant funds and more spare time to spend on